I'm Bree Luck, and you are listening to the Pause to Go podcast, where we explore the process of turning life's transitions into stellar transformations. You can expect interviews with experts, straight talk with remarkable humans, and conversations about making the most of every phase of life. Because when we approach life's stickiest spots with curiosity, support, and a little bit of inspiration, anything is possible. So whether you're on your way to work or settling in with your favorite beverage, together we can pause to go. As a solopreneur, I really like the flexibility to work from pretty much anywhere, so I'm happy to head down to Code-Based Co-working, where I can enjoy the company of others while I tackle my to-do list. Also, they have a state-of-the-art, consumer-friendly podcasting studio that is, frankly, my home away from home. So head over to Code-Based Co-working, check it out, and when you do, tell them that Bree sent you. Today, we have another Menopause with Friends episode, and this week I'm delighted to introduce you to my friend Dawn Schimke. Dawn is an herbalist and works with plant medicines. For many, many years, she worked in the hospitality industry, but she got out, and so she calls herself a recovering hospitality specialist. But today, we talk specifically about her journey through perimenopause and menopause. Dawn also struggled with some pre-existing conditions, PCOS, which is polycystic ovarian syndrome, and a genetic disorder called Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome. So I found it really illuminating to look at the interplay of the perimenopausal roller coaster with those pre-existing conditions. It's important to remember that perimenopause does not happen in a vacuum. We also talk very, very frankly about mental illness and suicidal ideation. So if that's a possible trigger for you, please proceed with caution. As always, the information contained in this podcast is no substitute for professional and individualized medical care or psychological support. In fact, it is our hope that these conversations will give you the tools to get the excellent help you deserve when you need it. I have loved hearing from so many of you when a guest shares something that really resonates with your experience, or that sparks new conversations or ways of thinking about your own health, sexuality, or relationships. I've even had a few folks reach out to me who are nowhere near menopause or will never go through menopause. So thank you for being great allies to those of us who are in the thick of it. If you have questions about menopause or perimenopause that have not been answered so far in this season of Pause to Go, DM me with your questions on Instagram at The Lovely Unbecoming. Voice memos are great. Or email me at bree@thelovelyunbecoming.com, and I'll try to address them before I wrap up season 1 later this month. The links to both of those are in the show notes. In short, this is the week to send me your questions or thoughts about menopause and perimenopause. And for now, enjoy this conversation with my friend Dawn. Well, I'm really happy to have you here today because I know that we have connected over the last couple of years about your work with herbs as an herbalist.
Yes.
And plant medicines, which is something that I've been intrigued by and interested in for a while too. And so I'm really happy to have you here to talk a little bit about perimenopause and menopause and your story in relation to that as a healer and as a human. Dawn, I'd love to begin by asking you a question that I ask everyone on the podcast, which is, how old are you and where are you in the perimenopause menopause process?
I am 51 and change, and I am in menopause, and I actually was in full menopause by the time I was 47. And so the peri years were they were distinct, but they were shorter than average, I believe. So there's good points and bad points. And there's a whole backstory to why I am in menopause at a relatively early age.
Well, let's talk about that. Why are you in menopause at what feels like a relatively early age? Because yes, the average age for menopause is between 50 and 51. So
Right.
47 is a little shy of that.
So when I was 21 years old, just on the cusp of graduating from college, I discovered rather abruptly that I had an ovarian cyst. And I didn't discover, obviously, the OBGYN discovered, but I went in because I'm not sure if it was a routine checkup or if I went in because I was experiencing some pain, but I believe it was routine. And then I spoke of experiencing pain occasionally. And it was pain during sex, during intercourse, and not all the time, but some of the time. And so he was an old school OBGYN. He was actually my mom's, and had saved her life when she was after she had my sisters. Her placenta hadn't been completely removed because my sisters were premature twins, and the complications, of course, with that are hemorrhaging. And he saved her life, and she was very loyal to him. And so I went to him as well. He was an older guy and a little intimidating to me, but he did a little feeling around in the old ovary area, and he referred me straight on to get an ultrasound. So within 2 weeks, I was in the hospital having my left ovary removed. And I'm really fortunate because I signed a waiver that said they could basically take out both ovaries, and probably do a full hysterectomy if it came to it. And I was 21 and I didn't really understand how that would affect me at the time. Like, I was not thinking about the future, but luckily, so I had this large dermoid cyst removed. It was not by laparoscopic or anything like that, like they tend to do now. I had a big belly button to bikini line incision, and they left the fallopian tube, which is an interesting decision to me, but they thought it was the best decision. And I got better. I recovered. They put me on birth control. I hadn't been on birth control before to sort of regulate my menstrual cycles, which I believe were pretty irregular, but that's what they do with people generally, as a first line of defense against polycystic ovary syndrome. And then I was fine. There weren't any issues. And I had an idea in my head that my one ovary wasn't sufficient to, have a child. But I did have a child, and she's awesome. She's 23. And so it was like a really, I don't know. I feel like it was physically very traumatic, but I wasn't processing it as such at the time. And then I just moved on. So I believe, even though I had plenty of eggs to conceive, I assume that, my right ovary just finally was like, okay, we're done. That's enough. Mm-hmm. And it was at a younger age.
So they didn't have any conversation with you that you remember about fertility, about what it meant to have one ovary. Was there any discussion about that?
There was no conversation. I am pretty sure, I found even, admitting to my doctor that I was having sex, very embarrassing. And it was clearly obvious that I was, because I had been in for other issues. I had some HPV when I was maybe 19 or 20 and was treated for that.
It does, even saying I was embarrassed to tell my doctor that I was having sex, embarrassed to have that discussion, it really does bring up, that kind of shame and embarrassment around sex, sexual activity is pervasive. It's real and it's pervasive, and it's the very thing that we need to not be ashamed of so that we can be honest with our medical care providers and with the people in our lives and with ourselves too,
Yeah.
So
And my mom was a feminist. She worked professionally and she did a lot of things professionally. We had the sex talk when I was maybe 8 or 9, because I would, as soon as she got home from the grocery store with her women's magazines, Women's Day and Family Circle, I would snatch them away and read them cover to cover. So I was reading stories about people, teen pregnancies and a man with prostate cancer. And there was the phrase making love. And so she needed to have the sex talk with me. And, she explained, and I was skeptical. I was like, I don't think so. But I had to take her word for it. And fourth grade health class, we talked about things, but she was a feminist in her work life and in social issues and equality and that type of thing. But in terms of educating me, and I assume my sisters, about sexuality, that did not happen. I was given advice as maybe a 17 or 18-year-old to be careful, which didn't mean anything to me. And how I learned about sex was reading books about troubled teens and the Clan of the Cave Bear. That is some steamy material. That's how I learned about like oral sex and anything about sex being pleasurable.
I think a lot of us Gen X women, that was our first exposure to very graphic descriptions of sex. I do remember reading Clan of the Cave Bear like 3 times in one summer when I was.
Yeah. And I don't know that my mom had read it, but again, swiped from the nightside table. She did not buy it for me. If my dad had known, that would have been trouble, because he wanted kids to be kids. Children didn't have much agency in his world. And so I remember being 17 and him telling me I couldn't watch An Officer and a Gentleman. And I guess, I didn't perceive it at the time, but I lived in what was a sexually conservative home.
Yeah. Yeah. As did many of us, right? And Buffalo, New York, so it's the Northeast. I had another guest on, Kira Hauer, and we were talking about the puritanical East Coast views on sexuality, and you were certainly right in it. And I'm imagining then that you heard nothing from your family about menopause or perimenopause if you got so little information about sex.
No. But I will tell you that my mom well, she's passed now, not my mom. My mom is alive, and my mom's identical twin passed 3 or maybe 4 years ago. I have like that COVID gap of how many years has it been. But she came to Buffalo during that time when I had the surgery, and I'm trying to think if it was 1989 or 1990. But she was the executive director of Planned Parenthood of Buffalo. And so she was really into teachable moments. And we would have these family dinners, and she, would somehow wedge in a teachable moment about sexuality. And my mom would, oh, Carolyn, it was interesting how they had completely different approaches, in terms of being open and honest about sexuality. And I think for me, that really, even though I still had a very hard time communicating, for me, that was an opening, a way for me to see that people didn't necessarily have to be ashamed. I still was, and I knew that not everybody was. So maybe that was a goal to work toward.
Yeah, shame. It's so interesting when you have that realization that shame is in many ways selective. This is part of my work, right? My company is The Lovely Unbecoming, and it's about deconditioning. How do we unbecome so that we can become, right? How do we unbecome so that we can move forward with integrity and free of shame. And I think that that is what you're describing there is it's like a true coming of age, right? When you begin to realize that the shame that felt like it was such a part of you, that it was a part of everyone, that it was just the way life was, suddenly you realize, oh no, this is actually a cultural issue. Even if you don't quite grasp that, just grasping, oh, not everyone feels this. They're doing things that I would find shameful in myself, but they're not shameful. And it's exciting and scary to find that. So what a time. What a time. So let's fast forward now. Let's fast forward.
Yeah.
I do think that many of us, as we go through perimenopause and menopause, it's one of two things. Either, and this is me reducing it, of course, to two things, because we still seek the binary, another conditioning. But let's say there are many ways. Here are two things that I've seen in people who are going through perimenopause and menopause. Number one is that their experience of perimenopause and menopause almost mirrors in inverse their experience of puberty. So that the shame, the frustration, the despair, the loneliness, the whatever issues came up, or if they had a really great, I don't know anyone who had a really great puberty experience, but I'm assuming that it could happen that way too, that they're sort of a mirror, that you sort of repeat that process, only it's for many people scarier because there's also this cultural loss of purpose issue that comes up for a lot of women. And on the other side of that is this other approach. And this is what we want, right? This is what we want for more people who are going through menopause to experience, which is I can take ownership of this experience and have an understanding of it that I did not have in puberty. And I can move forward armed with this information and community and support and have a perimenopause that is much more on my own terms. So I'm seeing both of those. I don't know many people who have had the second one, but I am finding more of them as I interview people, which is exciting.
Right.
And I'm wondering, what was your experience?
Well, okay. In terms of the dyad, puberty was not fun, but perimenopause. So I will say right now, I am a proud crone. And when you look at the maiden, the mother, and the crone, yeah, there is a lot of fear around that transition. And I remember before I sort of knew I was in that transition, I was doing a show. So the person who was choreographing, and I actually before this looked up her age. She's about 8 years older than I am. But she was speaking about her hot flashes and how intense they were. And like she would have them while, during a rehearsal. And she'd be like, oh, I just want to go into a freezer right now. And I'm like, wow, that's interesting. But for me, I didn't have a whole lot of super obvious signs clinically. Like I still was having fairly regular menstrual cycles, but I did start gaining weight in a situation where maybe I wouldn't have necessarily been gaining weight in terms of my physical activity. I would go to the doctor and think, am I losing hair? I'm depressed. Is there something wrong with my thyroid? But my thyroid test came back in the normal range. Now, they were only testing for the T4 and TSH. They weren't doing the full panel. So whether it was hypo or not is still a question mark because doctors really don't want to necessarily do a full panel unless they see a very clear reason to, or you have good insurance is what I have found. And so I would go in and say, I'm gaining weight, and they would focus on the depression aspect of it. And they wanted to send me to the therapist. So I went to the therapist and I tried to be game about it, but that wasn't necessarily that wasn't necessarily the issue at hand. What did happen, which could have been a big, big signifier, however, it wasn't super. I was very busy at the time. I was managing a luxury country inn. I'm a hospitality veteran, or as I like to say, a recovering hospitality specialist. And so it was a luxury country inn. I was managing that. I was managing the fine dining restaurant attached to it. I was in charge of operations, in charge of staffing. I loved parts of my job, and it was completely overwhelming because I was probably doing the work of at least 2, if not 3 people. But I did manage to forge a relationship with somebody, and a long distance relationship. And he came to visit and we had sex. And a few weeks later, I was like, I'm late. And I was like, wow, my breasts feel big. My feet feel big. And for me, that's the first sign of pregnancy. My feet don't feel right in my shoes. And lateness can be a matter of a few days. But I was like, no, this isn't right. And so I would go take the test, but my hormones weren't high enough to detect a pregnancy test, and I was going to the doctor after taking the home test because I was like, oh, yeah. So finally, and I was 44, almost 45, and I'm thinking, wow, what am I going to do? This is a tough situation for somebody at my age. And also looking at the prospect, I had a daughter who was almost 17. And I'm like, I'm going to start over again now, and feeling pretty wiped out from being a single parent. But again, I was having all the side effects of pregnancy, but the hormone levels weren't showing up. So I go to a lab to get a blood test. And yeah, sure enough, I was pregnant, but the next day I miscarried. And it wasn't hard, it wasn't emotionally hard for me because I had a lot of uncertainty, and I'm still friends with this guy, but it was a long distance relationship. I don't think either of us were all in. And he wasn't interested in being a father. I did share it with him. And he was like, I have never in my 53 years had a pregnancy scare. And I remember I told him right before, scare, of course, nice loaded term.
He had never had a pregnancy scare, but I guarantee you that his partners did. I guarantee you. And that as we're also talking, right. John and I are talking. Today is December 2nd, and I just think it's important to point out that it's also the week that the Supreme Court is re-examining abortion laws. And we won't get into that right now, but I just have to say that anytime that we are talking about anything with sexuality, we keep coming up against the way that the medical field, the laws, and even just the sense of personal responsibility are skewed in a way that really benefits men, men. And your sexual partner's response is a perfect example of that. In 53 years, he had never had a pregnancy scare, when I am certain that you are not the first person to have a pregnancy scare with him.
Right. And just even the term, I was like, but it's not even your body. How scared can you be? But the point was, he had never, ever, ever intended to be a dad. So anyhow, I have this miscarriage, and that's really when those, symptoms sort of kicked into gear, where I think that my hormones at that point, my hormones were just like, we've had enough, we can't do this every month. I was still having regular cycles, but I was just, feeling off. And I had some life circumstances that would also cause me some really stressful things happening in the background. So it was hard to tease out what was stress related, what was physical, bodily changes related. And I think that's true for a lot of people. I was a little more aware, and this is where, we can touch on herbalism. I had started my herbal studies in 2007. So we were pretty accustomed to talking about bodies, about women's bodies, about, there's a lot of talk about yonis, which I don't know if it's a culturally appropriate term for me, a white woman, to use. However, that's the way of some of those healing communities. So I wasn't shy necessarily about talking about it, but I still didn't have really a full picture that I was in perimenopause. And one of the premenstrual symptoms I would always have was it was not necessarily depression. I would have random, and it wasn't random, but it felt like random suicidal ideation the day before I would start my cycle. And it would just mess with my mind every single month. It was like, why do I feel this way? And then, oh yeah, got it. And then I didn't have really difficult moods beyond the first day or so. By day 2, I was pretty elated. So you could see, that my hormones were maybe moving a little more rapidly. Maybe there were more in my system. And I'm not, and maybe it was because this one ovary was working so hard to compensate and was signaling to my brain that it had to compensate for my left ovary not being there. I mean, obviously I can't see or can't tell what that process was. Those are my theories about it.
One of the things that I have learned in these many discussions about perimenopause and menopause is that I had this understanding of menopause, which was a flawed understanding. It was wrong. So I'm just saying this was wrong, which was that hormones would just sort of gradually decrease until I didn't have periods anymore. That's what I thought would happen. Mm-hmm. And what seems to happen with a lot of people who have or have had ovaries is that they have exactly what you were experiencing, extreme spikes and dips, these fluctuations that are marked fluctuations, and that you can actually have an intensification of hormone saturation as well as a depletion, right? So, and premenstrual period is a time when those spikes already happen. And then during perimenopause, they can become even more extreme. So just reflecting as a non-medical practitioner, learned just enough to get myself into trouble. That seems to be something that the people who are talking about it talk about those kinds of fluctuations happening.
Yes. So anyhow, going back, I moved to Charlottesville at the end of 2016, beginning of 2017. And I took a hospitality job at a new place that was opening. And it opened in July. And we went through our little training. And then during the grand opening, they, of course, had a lot of staff. So I remember being there and having a hot flash. And I was standing there because it was pretty intense. My whole face just felt flushed, and I just felt, my whole body felt hot. And then it stopped, and I recognized, I was like, oh, that's a hot flash. Okay. And it was summertime, so who knows? But I feel like I had them for about, 6 weeks. And my last menstrual cycle, I believe, was that July. And I think it was fairly normal. And then I didn't have one in August of 2017. And I'm like, okay, well, we'll see. Because I know a lot of people who would go, 3 or 4 months without a cycle, and then they would experience fairly extreme menstrual flooding. And so as an herbalist, I was ready. I knew what I was going to do with herbs and the plan that I had, but that didn't happen. My cycle stopped, and every month I'd be like, I'm 1 month closer to the year. I'm 1 month closer to the year. And I wasn't necessarily having an easy time in my life. And yet at the same time, I was pretty pumped because I didn't have to worry so much about the ideation that was like every month and pretty debilitating, because what happens with suicidal ideation is that it's traumatic and that can feed into PTSD. And I know that is another subject that you are familiar with and are very,
tapped into it.
You understand. But when I first came to that understanding, that was a big relief. And that was years before I read something about PTSD and realized that whatever I was feeling on a monthly basis was really feeding into that PTSD, and that maybe there was a way to get out of having these PTSD symptoms, and that there were ways to reduce them. And part of reducing symptoms is understanding them and understanding why they're happening, because when something is happening that there's no paradigm for explanation, where it doesn't make sense, I think societally, it tends to be interpreted as a moral failing. I don't know if it's the Judeo-Christian punishing God type of thing, the prosperity gospel, all those types of things. When we feel bad, when we're unwell, we're doing something wrong. That's sort of the prevalent thinking. And I mean, if you go into a medical office, of course, and you're gaining weight, well, there must be something wrong with your mind, or you're not getting enough exercise, or you're doing this, or you're doing that, and you need to do this. Not feeling well isn't met with nurturing in our society. It is met with a to-do list. And it just, that brings tears to my eyes, because it's so mean. It's unkind. So anyhow, I went through the next year, and I was feeling pretty okay about approaching cronehood. And I have a friend who has a Red Tent community, and I think it was that June, I went up for solstice.
Can you tell us a little more about what a Red Tent Society is?
Okay, so, and I am going to first preface it with that it tends to be that a lot of Red Tent societies tend to be very gender binary. So while they are helpful, they also can be not inclusive. So the Red Tent is the place where women go and gather, or a Red Tent is a refuge for the woman who is in her menstrual cycle. And it is a place where there's nurturing care for the woman who does have energy depletion, because they are doing a lot of work to shed the lining of their uterus and to, come back again. I mean, it's not easy to do. And I think we take it for granted. So please excuse the fact that I am speaking in gender binary, because not all people with uteruses and ovaries are women or identify as women. And so my friend actually had a little red tent, and she would invite people for seasonal gatherings. I was there presenting, and it was the solstice in 2018. I just remember saying, I'm almost a crone. Woohoo! I was excited about it. And not that I don't love being a mother or being in that phase, but I was ready. I was ready. And there's some things I wasn't ready for. I, feel that, I don't know if it's hormone levels or whatever, it is, that people can detect. People detect pheromones. We're very sensitive. Our noses are sensitive, but we don't process it as such. But the invisibility of a woman who is past her reproductive age, Whew, that has been a tough one for me, feeling invisible. And I think that, existed before and it intensified. And, a certain sense of ageism. And then I also deal with other things. The genetic disorder I have has been more prevalent in my life than being postmenopausal.
Right. We haven't really talked about the genetic disorder that you have yet.
Yeah.
But do you feel that, for some people who have pre-existing illnesses or disease or conditions, perimenopause is often a time of exacerbation of symptoms or the way it's showing up. And menopause can either be an exacerbation or a relief from those symptoms. And for some people, it doesn't really change much at all. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your pre-existing condition and how this phase in life has impacted that?
Right. So the genetic disorder is called Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome. And for anybody who's listening, it's EHLERS-DANLOS. And it is a genetic disorder that affects the way the body produces collagen. And it's considered a connective tissue disorder. Collagen is the most abundant protein in the body. So it's everywhere. Joints, bones, ligaments that hold your uterus up, eyes, teeth, brain, veins, arteries. And there are different kinds. The most common kind is hypermobile, or HEDS. And then there are a lot of less common kinds. The manifestations are very, very broad. Ehlers-Danlos is also related to co-occurring conditions, which include dysautonomia, often POTS. And dysautonomia is where the autonomic nervous system of the body, the part of the body that's supposed to be on autopilot, isn't. And that can result in a lot of different things. Let's just say anything that you think should be going without you thinking about it, happening without you thinking about it, heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, that can all be compromised by dysautonomia. And it's such a big topic that I really don't want to go too far into it. But one of the most common kinds in people with EDS is called POTS, or postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, which means sitting down, you're normal, and stand up and the heart rate spikes very, very significantly. And that's hard. That's hard on the cardiovascular system. It can create a cascade effect. And then there's also mast cell activation disorder as another part of what they call the trifecta. So I've experienced all of those, and I'm fortunate in that I function most of the time pretty normally, but I can have flares. And I believe that the flares have been related to hormonal shifts in my life. So puberty, as I was approaching puberty, I remember having my shoulder randomly collapse while I was doing a handstand. That was not fun because I crashed down on my head. Having my ankle collapse out of nowhere. That happened when I was 12. And, that's right when I was in the thick of puberty. Migraines throughout my life. And then I had very, very early onset varicose veins as well. And that pretty much started right when I got to puberty, which is when you've got, more of those relaxing hormones coming into your body, things that help stretch out, which are good. They're functional. But in my case, they created some issues, some real bad issues. And then, of course, when I was pregnant, my veins were exacerbated. And the whole story of how I came to herbalism was because an herbalist saved my pregnancy because I was having some significant problems. And the medical community kind of gave me the shrug. And my husband at the time was seeing this Chinese doctor So I went with my husband to an appointment, and Dr. Shu listened to my pulses and he said, I'll give you a strong baby. And his wife was the apothecarist, and she mixed up some god-awful herbs. I cannot even tell you how bad they tasted. And yet my symptoms, my hemorrhaging, because I was like hemorrhaging, ER style hemorrhaging. I had been to the ER 3 times. Within I'd say a week to 10 days, the hemorrhaging had stopped. And my baby was just term, but I do feel like I had an exacerbation of symptoms during that time in terms of my genetics. And I feel that also during the perimenopause, I was having additional symptoms of Ehlers-Danlos. And I had been diagnosed in 2013. But I was really intent on managing it by myself and kind of pushing my way through, because I was still in hospitality. In hospitality, you're tough. You don't want to show too many weaknesses. So I would literally, this is not even joking, I would work until I couldn't walk. I would hobble out to my car. And so I beat myself up. I beat myself up a lot. And one of the things that happened after I stopped menstruating, I realized that was my last official job in hospitality, that I was not going to work. And that's why I call myself a recovery and hospitality specialist, because, I enjoyed interacting with guests. I loved my guests. I loved exceeding their expectations. So I decided that I needed to go all in on herbalism, because there's a different form of guest and there's different ways of exceeding expectation and taking care of people. And I could take that nurturing, mothering side of myself and put it into something that actually would have a more significant impact. So that's really, for me, menopause, I wouldn't say it's always a walk in the park. It's been a relief. I don't have migraines. I don't have those super intense mood swings. Not to say I don't feel anxious or depressed some of the time, because we live in this world.
Right. But you're not having the hormonal fluctuations that seem to drive the extremes of that. So what is one thing, as an herbalist, what is one thing that you think that people who are going through perimenopause should know or do?
One thing, that's a tough question. I would say this is my one thing. So I think herbs are great, and I could talk about so many herbs that are pertinent to the reproductive system. And that wouldn't do anybody a lot of good, because everybody is constitutionally specific. And while there are some herbs that I absolutely love, like let's say holy basil or Tulsi, I am not going to make a blanket statement and say that everyone listening to this right now should go out and get some holy basil. But it is generally considered safe, and it is an adaptogen, and it has so many wonderful benefits. It's relaxing. It's such a gentle, beautiful herb. However, a lot of the herbs that are traditionally used in teas and potions, the mineralizing herbs, nettles, say red clover, which is mildly estrogenic. So everyone, again, these are not recommendations, but things that women often use are high in minerals. And I would say that it is really good to protect your bones, because at this time, this is where there are so many shifts. And your system pulls the minerals from your bones to compensate for other systems. So my personal regimen involves taking magnesium, which is, I take a liquid magnesium, but I actually take a homeopathic magnesium, and that is protective to my cardiovascular system. Personally, it is protective to my cardiovascular system. It's also been said that it helps with the metabolism and accessibility of vitamin D. And those are such big things. So what this all leads to is when we have a lot of estrogen in our body, and estrogen is stored in our fatty tissues, right? And it is what moistens us and makes us kind of juicy. And that's good for the most part. People can have too much juiciness, and that leads to things like edema and so on and so forth. That's a different issue. At the time when estrogen stops being circulated in our body, people with uteruses and ovaries, their systems go, oh no, how are we going to keep our estrogen in our body? Let's put some more fat on so there's more places to store that estrogen. And so, for anybody who is experiencing that perimenopause or menopausal weight gain, it is your body loving on you and saying, we want you to stay, we want to protect you, because that juiciness, that moisture is protective. It's like, internal bubble wrap or something. But better than bubble wrap. That should be a product. And so the postmenopausal woman can be drier and more brittle, which, of course, that's why we hear about hip breaks and bone breaks and, all those types of the skin, collagen's not in our skin, hair gets drier, everything changes and it's seen as undesirable, but protecting it through moisturizing, and not just external moisturizing, but internal moisturizing agents is probably my number one recommendation, and keeping up on your minerals. Vitamins are good, but definitely do not ignore the minerals. And I'm not a nutritionist, but if there are issues, I would say go to a nutritionist and address that. And I will add one anecdote. I didn't realize I was magnesium deficient until 2019. And I ate every day of my life for like several years an undignified amount of almonds. And they probably didn't have very accessible magnesium, but I was desperate for it. I also could not get enough spinach, avocado, or dark chocolate. Those all are rich in magnesium. And while I still love those things and I still will eat those things because they're delicious and wonderful, I don't have to have them. I do not need to eat 8 ounces of almonds in a day. Once I started supplementing with magnesium, that craving diminished. And that tightness in my chest that I often felt, and I don't know if other people feel it, that diminished to a large extent. Sometimes, like taking a little dropperful of liquid magnesium when I'm feeling like I can't breathe is one of the biggest chill pills I've ever taken in my life. Now, magnesium may not be for everybody because it is relaxing and it can have effects on the digestive system. So I always say that caveat, but for me, it was a game changer.
And also for some people, having that relaxing effect on the digestive system can be helpful too. That can be something that can be helpful for us. And so I love that recommendation. Thank you so much for joining me on this, for talking so openly and frankly about your experiment. It's always an experiment, right? Your experience with perimenopause and menopause, particularly the mental health side of that and what you were experiencing there, because I truly believe that feeling less alone in the process is a major part of moving through it in a supported way, and that makes it easier. So thank you for that. And I will put all of the links in the show notes for this.
Yes.
All of the links to all of your platforms in the show notes for this.
We're just awash in platforms for sure. But yeah, this has been awesome. And like, I appreciate the opportunity to be authentic, in this conversation, because me as a 20-year-old, this would have been a 5-minute conversation.
And here we are. I'm sure I have full confidence that we could talk all day.
I know. But yeah, like I'm like what they would refer to as a long talker, but that's I think, I've also got the perspective now to go with it. So,
well, thank you for the long talk.
Yeah, thank you.
Here are my key takeaways from my conversation with Dawn. Number 1, our culture tends to look at illness as a moral failing, maybe now more than ever. And whether we are talking about the super problematic body mass index or our mental health, we need to change that perspective from the ground up. Number 2, fluctuating hormones can coincide with flare-ups for pre-existing conditions. So be sure to talk to your healthcare provider about all of your symptoms, even if they don't feel relevant. Number 3, while there's no one-size-fits-all solution for women who are having side effects from the perimenopause mayhem, magnesium is a mineral that can bring a lot of women greater ease and calm. And full disclosure, magnesium was a total game changer for me when I was suffering from insomnia. Find out more about Dawn, including where to take her workshops and classes on herbalism, in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening to the Pause to Go podcast. If you got something out of this episode, let us know. Share it with a friend, join our Facebook group, and subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts if you loved it. If not, no worries. We want you to tell it like it is, and we'd love to have your input. If you want to know more about what I'm up to, you can follow me on Instagram at The Lovely Unbecoming or at my website, thelovelyunbecoming.com. Stay curious, y'all.